we are an old city compared to suburbs, right? We have a lot of older buildings. And we also still operate buildings that were constructed when the school district, according to a federal judge, was still building buildings in an explicitly racist fashion to segregate its students. The district at the time was building large school buildings in predominantly minority neighborhoods. That's the language in the court case. So that basically any demographic change, right, any growth in students who are not white could be put in these big buildings, right, so that they would not go to the smaller white schools.
We're rolling. We're rolling.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.
There's nothing wrong with a woman talking like a pirate. There's just not.
I want everyone to be themselves today. It's fine.
Okay.
It's fine.
Just wanted to ask that out of the gate.
I'm glad
so
you
I don't
asked.
offend.
And, feel free to interrupt me if you want, although I probably won't talk very much, and interrupt each other. It's a free-for-all.
Okay.
It's a free-for-all.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, I'm very nervous about this episode, and we haven't even introduced it yet.
What? Why nervous?
So, I got one tweet pushing. I linked to Melissa's story yesterday, and I got, to show you how sensitive I am, I got one reply where it's like, don't boost this. And I'm like, oh shit, what did I do? What have I stepped into? And compared to crime and safety politics, schools politics feels much more dangerous to me.
So here's kind of what I want to say, John, about that. And I didn't even bring my notes. So anyway, whatever. Is that I just think that when you talk about public education, you have to remember that there are two things that sit over all of it. There is racism and there is sexism, right? Because our public school systems were constructed in a racist fashion, right? For the purpose of educating white children. And also, education is a institution at the elementary and secondary level is primarily women, right? And the primary outside group that is involved is mothers, right? And so there are these intersecting layers of racism and sexism that sit in all of this. And so you just have to know that, right? And there are other dynamics, right? There are intersections of these things, right? Like the role of women of color, right? Families of color, yes. So just know that.
Before we get too deep into it, I'm going to introduce the show. This is the Wedge Live podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards, and I'm joined today by two Southwest Minneapolis moms and a dog.
Sorry.
Melissa Whitler writes for Southwest Voices. She writes about Minneapolis Public Schools.
Way down.
And our other guest is Sara Spafford Freeman, who Melissa used as an expert. Can I call you an expert, Sara?
Sure.
In Melissa's article that she wrote for Southwest Voices, which I was blown away by.
I didn't call Sara an expert, by the way. I did not give her
nor
that label.
Nor would I call myself an expert, but I'm eyeball deep in all of this, and so
Sarah's very knowledgeable.
Well,
I would say very knowledgeable is fair.
I'm kind of an accidental expert about zoning. I didn't go to the Humphrey School. I'm not educated in that way, but you watch enough meetings for enough years, and you learn a lot. Yes. That makes you an expert. So
I think that's true of Sara. I think that's true of David, who is also, someone who I talk to kind of more on background for the piece, I would say that about myself. I'm not sure I would even give myself the expert label, but I would say that it's something that I am interested in and that I have spent more than a few years and more than a few hours of my free time trying to learn about because I care about it.
And now you're writing for Southwest Voices. Writing about schools, I feel like is...
See that Melody brought me swag.
Oh, that's nice.
So I thought I had to represent today. So
you're filling an important gap, I feel, in local news coverage. I don't know where do I turn for schools news besides you?
Ooh,
is it a series of mom bloggers? Is that what I'm?
I don't know that there are any mom bloggers anymore. Do you know of mom bloggers, Sara?
I don't. There has been, in addition to Melissa, I think there's been good coverage from the Minnesota Reformer and Sahan.
Yep.
Even the Spokesman Recorder has done, some work. But, I think especially public schools, these public systems are kind of out of sight, out of mind for a lot of folks. So there hasn't been a ton of coverage, and there's certainly a need for more, work like Melissa's. And think
please
that
someone else do more work. That's
Melissa doesn't deserve a monopoly.
The Star Tribune has, dabbled. I think their education reporter is great, but the platform is challenging, I think, sometimes for this to rise to the top.
Also, I feel like their beat is very expansive, right? They're focused, more metro-wide schools in general, which just, from covering this stuff with the city, John, that the school board meets for multiple hours twice a month, right? Like most people don't want to dedicate that much time to just watching meetings, right? That's expensive reporting time just to have someone watch the meetings. So, and then now the policy committee, the finance committee at the school board, those are no longer streamed. You have to actually go to Davis Center if you want to know what's happening.
When did they stop streaming?
In August.
Yeah, that's not acceptable.
School year.
That is not acceptable.
Write a letter, please.
Yeah, and that lack of coverage, the lack of transparency feeds into the conspiracy-laden, tweet you got, because a lot of this information, the information and data are all there, but it requires time and effort.
Years.
Right. But it requires time and effort to understand it, and there are nuances and twists and turns. It's like Dynasty at the Davis Center right now. And so I think, the coverage is important. I'm glad you're wading into these waters and you're in good hands to have this discussion, because I think there's just a lot of really important basic knowledge about public schools that a lot of people don't have ready access to.
Can I just want to say one other thing about that, which is that, again, the information is there, right? And also, the district operates on the same timeline every year, right? The pro forma financial statement comes out in November or December. It comes out with the audit report. So the school district finances are audited every year by a third party, a professional firm, right? They're not, so they can't do funny monkey business, right? There is an auditor. That comes out in November. They construct building budgets in January. They send them to principals in the middle of February. Those are due back in March. The board has to vote by state law by June 30th on a budget. This timeline of how things happen is consistent year to year, right? So the reason that I wrote about this now is because the school board is talking about the budget now, right?
Right. You're not trying to sabotage the teachers union, right? That's not why we're talking about this. I am extremely sympathetic to all the teachers' statements about how they're underpaid. the support staff is underpaid. Like, that all seems true to me. And I don't see talking about the dire financial circumstances of the district as an argument for the teachers to not strike. I'm not, maybe it gets the attention of the state legislature and they said, hey, we are going to use some of this $8 billion surplus to fill these many gaps, these unfunded mandates that you talked about in your article. But let's talk about that big deep budget hole, and how devastated should I be? I felt very devastated reading every paragraph. What I started doing was taking a screenshot of like the important parts, and I ended up taking a screenshot of every paragraph in the whole thing because it was one bombshell after another.
And it shouldn't be a bombshell because there's nothing in there that hasn't been shared in publicly available documents for many years.
Yeah.
And screamed about by advocates and organizers like me.
Yeah.
The writing has been on the wall for many years, and so it may have landed like a bombshell, but I think that just speaks to how little we understand what's going on in Minneapolis public schools specifically, but public schools more generally.
I think it speaks to the fact I don't have a child, and I have decided this is the one part of local government I'm not going to pay attention to, because there's a lot to pay attention to. If you don't have a kid, it's nice to not have to pay attention to schools. I'm happy to pay the taxes, but give me a break. I'll just watch the planning commission. I won't watch the school.
And
board.
I will say to you, John, that I think that I understand where that attitude comes from, but it is very hard to explain to people who don't have children. And this isn't just about public district schools, but the role that a school plays in a family's life and in the life of children and their parents.
Well,
Sara, say more.
And it just, I'm a finance person, so it also ignores the state's biggest asset. This is not just the biggest line item in the state budget. This is also the state's greatest asset is our public education system. Economists have estimated that the return on investment for public education dollars is anywhere from 8 to 15 times. So we're also talking about a really important asset and investment that has been largely left to die on the vine the last 20 years. And all those chickens are coming home to roost, today as we face students being murdered, a looming teachers strike, an $8 billion state surplus, and all the rest of it, the impact of COVID, et cetera. All those chickens are coming home to roost, but it should matter to you even if you don't have a kid in Minneapolis public schools, because it's both one of the state's biggest expenditures and one of its greatest assets.
I like to think of it as like the education system, right? Our kids are the goose that lays the golden eggs, right? If you do not feed your goose, like your goose is not giving you golden eggs, right? Like if you want Minnesota to have a thriving economic system, right? Like you have to fund this stuff. Period.
And also just the idea of like complete neighborhoods. You want a grocery store, a hardware store, a school.
Right.
You want abundant, affordable housing so that, and you want people to have transit access. It's about how our city functions and is healthy. Schools are one of the most vital things to making that a reality, I think.
And we could talk about the intersection with housing because I know you care a lot about that, but I mean, school assignment is based on where you live. So if you do not desegregate your housing, which in Minneapolis means having housing affordable to multiple types of income, right?
Yeah.
then you will not desegregate your schools.
Yeah, our
period.
exclusionary zoning and affordable housing and housing segregation problem is the school segregation problem, right? It's the same thing.
Well, and all of those disparities being created by city and county and state level systems show up literally and figuratively in our public schools in the forms of these students. So whether it's housing and food insecurity and instability, or learning English as a second language, or having a disability, all of these struggles, zoning struggles, desegregation struggles, show up in our public schools, and we are disinvesting in them at a pretty systematic level while the challenges they're facing are only getting greater.
So let's talk about let's finally get into it, state disinvestment, because you talked about, Melissa, the 3 problems. The first one is disinvestment in public education by the state legislature. So explain that, Melissa.
Sara will probably explain it more eloquently than I will. But no, but I mean, the state used to put on a real dollar term, right? Not nominal, but on a real dollar term, more money into our public schools, right? And has slowly been decreasing that value over time. At the same time, right, we have students that our schools serve who need more from our schools. And, right, this is not, no one argues with that, right? There is state and federal policy that lays out specifically which students qualify for which services, right? And primarily it's special education services, it's English learner services, and our policies recognize that students who come from low income households, right, oftentimes need more from our schools. And we recognize this. No one argues with this, right? It is not a disputed fact. It is part of our funding policies, right? But with that recognition, right, the state in particular does not provide the funding for the services that it says those students need.
So we've got 2 things. We've got the state not sending as much money in inflation adjusted terms.
Right.
Over time, over decades, the money coming from the state has gotten less, and they're requiring you to fund special education, English learner stuff, that you're required to provide it, but they're not funding it at a level that pays for it fully. That's the unfunded mandate part. Sara?
And let's apply some numbers to these so that people can grasp, the extent of the issue. So part of it is state disinvestment in general ed funding, which is, almost 3/4 of a school district's total funding comes through the general ed formula. Those increases.
Can we just say general education formula funding, right? It's unrestricted. A school district can spend that. The school board gets to decide how to spend it. The state doesn't tell them, spend it on X, Y, and Z. So that's an important piece of this to understand. That is your unrestricted pool of money.
And that unrestricted pool comprises roughly 70% of K-12 budgets, and it's increased on average 1.5% for 20 years. While inflation and costs incurred by these districts have grown at a rate, 2-3 times that. So that's part of the state disinvestment, is just the fact that if you chart general ed formula revenue the last 20 years, it's literally a flat line. The other problem that you referenced and that Melissa referenced is the cross-subsidy costs. So the fact that school districts are mandated to provide services and supports that the state does not fund them to do it. For MPS this year, the cross subsidies associated with special ed and English language learner services is $75 million this year. And that, when you layer those structural issues upon a district whose enrollment is dropping, in the last 10 years, close to 15%, what you end up with is what we're facing today, which is MPS operating at a tremendous deficit. We used one-time federal, CARES Act money to plug a lot of those holes, but we've been essentially robbing Peter to pay Paul to make district finances work for 5 years and longer. And, teachers are reasonably asking for pay increases for themselves and ESPs and mental health supports, all these very reasonable asks that they deserve, but the money isn't there to do it. And when Melissa's piece named that, or when I've named it in other forums, folks don't want to hear that reality because it sort of clouds the messaging that's coming behind the demands.
And my understanding is that St. Paul has not used their COVID money in the same way. Is that correct?
They haven't had to plug as big of a hole.
So they're in a better financial situation.
Not much better, but
I was going to say they still have a deficit, but they are closing schools, right? And Minneapolis, enrollment kind of stabilized around 2012, and it fluctuates a little bit, but it stays around this 35,000 students a year until about 2018, right? But over that time period, the district was adding programs and adding buildings, right? And buildings, everyone thinks, oh, it's the heat, right? For the building, that's your fixed cost. No, to operate a school building, you have a fixed staffing cost, right? You have a principal, you have a school secretary, and yes, I believe that is the actual job title, so I'm not being misogynistic or antiquated, okay? The state requires an elementary school to provide physical education, art, and music as part of its elementary curriculum. So you have staff people who have to provide that at a school building, right? Your variable cost is your teachers, your classroom teachers, right? So you can adjust that, but you have a fixed staffing model to have a school building. So when you open up a new school building, right? Yes, you're paying heat. Yes, you're paying custodial staff. You're paying groundskeeping, but also you have staff that have to be there to support the students and the classroom teachers in that building.
So when we talk about the cross subsidy, I read in your article again that it's worse in Minneapolis than it is in suburbs and surrounding cities. It's worst in the state. Is that correct?
As far as I know, the last source I was able to find on this comes from the Association of Metropolitan School Districts. And Minneapolis is the worst. St. Paul is the second, right? And you have districts like Minnetonka where it's a third or less of the amount per student as an MPS.
Yeah, and that's all related to the student demographics in these districts. It's, we have higher concentrations of immigrants, that are sending their students to public schools and qualify for English learner services. And we have a much higher percentage of students receiving special ed resources than suburban, exurban, or rural districts.
And again, before I get lost, and I'm new to all this, but using a term like cross subsidy, I understand a lot of people hearing that don't know what it means. And I know we've explained it once, we should explain it again. It's like filling that unfunded mandate from the state. State says you have to provide these services. They don't fund it. And the cross subsidy is the school districts filling it with money they could be using for.
Well, and what happens is that cost is absorbed by school districts who have to use general ed money, which is unrestricted, to fill those gaps. MPS can't opt to pass on that unfunded mandate to someone else. The buck literally stops with them. Yeah. And so what they have to do is take money from that general ed pot of money to cover the costs of special ed and EL services.
So if you're in the suburban district that's not doing that, right, because you have students who have lower needs, right? Yes, you're not getting all these restricted funds, right? The restricted funds that come in for English learners, for students who qualify for special education services, right? For students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch. Those are very restricted, right? But you're the suburban district, you have the unrestricted dollars. You don't have to take those unrestricted dollars to pay for those restricted services, right? You get to take that money and, build a new science lab,
Right.
fund, not only do you have just music class, but maybe you have a vocal music class and you have instrumental music class. Maybe in art you have, visual arts and performance arts, right? Like you can offer all of this other stuff.
And here's a couple of numbers I'll drop into the conversation. $923 million is the gap statewide in terms of the unfunded mandate for special ed and English learner services. And the statewide budget surplus this year is $8 billion, which is a potential source to fill that gap.
And there is a bill that's been introduced in the House to close the special ed cross subsidy or address that cross subsidy. So I hope listeners who feel inclined to contact their state legislators will be sure to express support for doing that. It's critically important.
And by contact, call, don't email, but call,
Yeah.
leave a message, talk to a staff person, right? That is the most powerful way to reach them and tell them this. And I would also say, right, I mean, I'm not from Minnesota, but Sara is, right? If you have friends who live in outstate, in greater Minnesota, what is the appropriate term? Now, I don't want to offend anyone. If you have friends who live in suburban districts, you have family, right? Your aunts, your grandparents, your parents, right? They need to be contacting their representatives who are much more likely to be sort of moderate conservative Democrats and Republicans, and they need to hear about it because this is not just a Minneapolis DFL issue, right? They cannot solve this on their own.
Here's another bombshell number. Enrollment over the last 20 years has dropped 40%. I was shocked. That's at a time when Minneapolis has gained 10% in population. We've gone from like 380,000 people to 425,000 people, but enrollment in the schools has dropped 40%. Couldn't believe it. And then to go back to what we talked about earlier with the school building footprint, I think David, the guy that you consulted for your article, said that the current building footprint could accommodate 40% more students.
I think Sara agrees. I think I've maybe done a less close analysis than the two of them, but eyeballing, yeah.
Yeah, so David and I looked at the excess excess seats, basically excess capacity, and tried to estimate it in MPS, and it's around 10 to 12,000 extra seats. So we're paying for that footprint, but we're only being funded for current students because the vast majority of funding is issued on a per student basis, purely on enrollment numbers. So our budget has dropped as that enrollment decline of more than 40% has dropped as well.
And I want to say two things about the building footprint before we move on. So in Minneapolis, right, one of the things that we deal with in the building footprint, right, is that we are an old city compared to suburbs, right? We have a lot of older buildings, and we also still operate buildings that were constructed when the school district, according to a federal judge, was still building buildings in an explicitly racist fashion to segregate its students. So that is still impacting the district, right? The district at the time was building large school buildings in predominantly minority neighborhoods. That's the language in the court case, right? In order to fill them, right, with students who were not white, right? And building small schools in neighborhoods adjacent, right? That still had many white residents. So that basically any demographic change, right? Any growth in students who are not white could be put in these big buildings, right? So that they would not go to the smaller white schools. And we still live with that in our district. Sara, I mean, am I
Well,
like,
and
you can't talk about this without, in my opinion.
And not just the size of the building, the racism in the system isn't just reflected in the size of buildings that we built on the north side, for instance. It's also reflected in the style and vibe. I'm a proud member of Polar Nation, North High School, and if you walk through that school, one of the things you're struck by first is the lack of windows. My son was 4 and wanted to know why all the classrooms didn't have windows the way they did at his sister's elementary school in Southwest Minneapolis. So, the racism runs deep in all, is there built in at every single layer of this discussion.
So it's important to emphasize enrollment determines funding from the state. So when you lose students, you lose funding, kind of like a death spiral dynamic. You lose students, less money, less services. Then parents decide, I don't want to send my kids to school anymore. And then you have less students, less money, less services. And where does it stop, kind of thing?
Well, and that's what we're in the midst of right now. If you look at disenrollment from MPS, it's accelerated greatly over the last 3 school years. And I don't know where that, where do we bottom out? Because we're already operating at a tremendous deficit. We've plugged the holes we can plug. But that revenue may continue to drop if enrollment continues to drop. And we don't know where, that bottom will settle out.
So I was surprised to read somewhere, probably from Melissa, that schools are getting whiter. You would think the disenrollment was maybe driven by white families deciding, I have choices. I'm moving my kid to a private school. I'm moving them somewhere else. Schools are getting whiter. It's actually students of color who the schools are losing. So what is driving that, and what's driving the overall decline in enrollment over the last few decades?
So the whitening of the district, right, is something that the district reports, and I don't have good data on that to look at. So that's what they're saying, right? And so I just want to be clear, like when I say that, I try to make sure that I'm attributing it specifically to the district is saying this, right? Like, which is not to say that they're not telling the truth. I'm just saying, like, I don't really have good data on that right now. But I think the other piece of the conversation, which ties into something that you care about around housing, right, is that our housing is very expensive in Minneapolis. It is getting more expensive. And when you think about what it means to, raise children in the city, right, and oftentimes, most people don't want to do that in a 1-bedroom apartment, right? They like a little extra room. It gets very expensive, right? And so that pushes families out when they don't have access, right, to housing that is affordable for them.
To what degree are charter schools driving this? Because there was one detail that blew my mind in your article about how if a student moves from a public school to a charter school, the Minneapolis Public Schools has to reimburse their unfunded mandate costs at a higher rate than they get from the state. Is that accurate, or did I read that wrong?
So my understanding is that the way that it is currently written is that the school district, it reimburses them for 80% of that special education cross subsidy, right? That those special education costs that are not funded by the state, I should say. And then the state tops it up another 10%. Is that correct, Sara? Am I saying that the right way?
That's my understanding, but
Yeah.
that's a nuance I don't fully understand. But to your broader question about how that impact plays into this, it's an impact, but the district presented data at the committee of the whole meeting Tuesday night that quantified
Right.
where disenrollment, whether it's charter schools, private schools, etc. And that charter school impact has gotten smaller the last 5 years.
What is what's driving it then? What's having the biggest impact?
Ultimately, there's a drop in the number of school-age children who live in Minneapolis has declined. But I think my sense is the bigger
I'm not sure
impact.
that's true, Sarah. I think that's still holding pretty. I mean, it's come down, but I don't think it's bottomed out the way that enrollment has.
No, it's definitely not dropped as much as enrollment, but that line has come down. I think the biggest impact is it's not people who enroll in Minneapolis Public Schools and then leave. It's people who never enroll. And there are a lot of those people living in Minneapolis, as reflected by the gap between the number of school-age kids who live in the city and the number enrolled in Minneapolis Public Schools.
I could see that as housing gets more expensive. I live in a fancy house and I have the money to send my kid to a private school, and they never even touch the public schools.
Yep.
So I
right.
And there's a lot of
money
that.
just goes away. And the other thing that I want to say about this, I think it's like the tuition adjustment for special education. If you're trying to prioritize, right, what is the most important issue to address? That's not the one I would pick first. Would you agree, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, it's the special ed and EL cross subsidies we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars a year being absorbed by Minnesota Public Schools. In MPS, $75 million a year that we as a district are just having to absorb and steal from that general fund. So that is orders of magnitude bigger than the chargeback, costs associated with students leaving and going to charter schools.
Right. So I think that's another piece of this, is that when you're looking at, what's the policy fix, right? Because it's quite alarming, right, the situation. So how do we address it? You need to prioritize the things that are going to make the biggest impact. And if you keep tinkering around the edges, right, if you throw, a few $1 million here and a few $1 million there, right, at the district, they're in 2 years, the issue is still there, right? It needs a permanent fix, right? The system is not designed to be sustainable for a district like Minneapolis.
Well, and a few other numbers that I think are important context as we, lobby for Minneapolis Public Schools to get more money from the state is the fact that Minneapolis residents pay in the form of various state taxes $4 to the state for every dollar we get back in state aid. And as we contemplate how to use, an $8 billion budget surplus, I can't think of a place that is owed more than K-12 schools.
Yeah, we don't use that stat enough in the urban-rural divide, the warfare there. We should be throwing that in rural areas' faces all the time. Give us our money back.
I mentioned it to Senator Roger Chamberlain at a Senate Education Policy Committee hearing 2 weeks ago.
Oh,
that's
John,
that's
you
the
don't know
avatar.
who he is?
I don't pay attention to the state legislature. All your stories about the state legislature are lost on me, so you're gonna have to specify.
Yeah. You have to get out of City Hall, and you
have to
just
get out of the
have to
Wedge.
take a little peek.
I never leave the Wedge.
Over there. I mean,
Yeah.
and then go back to the Wedge and enjoy, your wonderful neighborhood. But
yeah, but Senate Republicans introduced, a proposal this morning to take the entire surplus and give it away in the form of tax cuts. So
to seniors, right? There was that we're gonna not give we're going to stop charging
Right.
taxes on rich seniors' Social Security.
So
But
your
as
boomer
someone-
in Southwest Minneapolis with their $1 million house, right? And
Right.
plus whatever they have in their 401k or their pension or whatever, right, is going to no longer pay taxes on a significant portion of their income, which, let's be clear, right, when you hit 70 and a half, right, you have to start taking money out of those IRA accounts, right? So for a lot of people, that's a substantial amount of money every year.
Yeah.
Well, and as someone who grew up in rural Minnesota, I can assure you those schools need greater state investment just as much as Minneapolis. It's one of those rare issues where there should be broad agreement.
Right. It's a
but
statewide problem. There are kids all
Exactly.
over the state. There are kids all over.
Well, and as I watch
They're
the
everywhere,
discussions, they're everywhere, John. Yeah, as I watch the discussions in St. Paul about the surplus, public education is almost nowhere. I trolled Governor Walz on Twitter a few weeks ago because he gave like a 9-minute interview to Minnesota Public Radio about his priorities for the surplus, and he didn't mention public schools. Dude's a fucking teacher, and
I mean, that was the whole reason
that gives
he's
you
elected,
a sense.
right?
Yeah, that gives you a sense, though, of the discussion in St. Paul and where public schools fit into the mix. They don't.
Yeah, not to veer off into crime politics, but when I see a story about like a 13 or 14-year-old who's involved in a horrific violent crime incident, I mean, that's partly a school issue. That's how we support families and children, is how we fund schools. And when very, very young children get off track like that, I think that's a school issue too. And I know the governor is very concerned about crime and safety. Maybe send some money to the schools.
Yeah.
Well, right. And you can't, I mean, we haven't talked about the impact of the pandemic on schools, but you cannot talk about what's happening with, young people in Minneapolis and nationally without talking about what it means, right, to lose, right, how the connection to a school and the people in that school, right, the students and the staff, has been impacted. Those relationships, as I said earlier, are so central to young children, right, middle schoolers, teenagers, right, the relationships they have with their teachers. And let me just say this, like, most people who send their kids to MPS schools love their teachers, right? I mean, people will complain from time to time, but the vast majority of people who send their schools to MPS have a generally positive experience. And if they didn't, they would leave because they have tons of choices, right? So when those relationships are, I mean, it's not that people didn't try, right? But those relationships are fragile, and so without the centering of that for kids through the pandemic, I mean, that has a huge impact on them.
So it occurs to me there's a thing called the comprehensive district design that was supposed to fix all this. I've learned that somehow segregation has gotten worse in our schools since that passed. Can you explain a little what the CDD is and how things has it not worked? Is the verdict in, or it's still out?
Can I give you my take, and Sara might give you a slightly different take? My take, this is, just like the facts, right, is the stated purpose of the CDD was to change the placement policy in the district, right? It reconfigured the magnet schools, right? Schools that people could enroll in that weren't assigned by their address, okay? So it's changed that from zoned magnet schools to citywide magnet schools. So before, they divided the city into 3 zones, right? Depending on where you lived, you had access to a set of magnet schools in that zone. Now we have 1 set of magnet schools for everyone in the city. So that was a change. Second, it changed the neighborhood boundaries for neighborhood schools, right? So some people got shuffled, right, around in terms of their neighborhood school changed because those geographic boundaries changed. And the consequence of that, right, of those boundary shuffling was trying to move enrollment around because Minneapolis had some schools that were overflowing, like literally more students than the district says the school should have inside the building, right? And some schools had very low enrollment compared to their capacity. So that's the sort of like explicitly stated purpose of this, right? And the outcome the district expected was that this would lead to less segregated schools, more integrated schools, and particularly the integration would be happening within the magnet schools. So that's kind of, and anytime you change boundaries and anytime you change magnet programs, people get mad. So Sara, you have maybe a slightly different take on this. So
I think in order to understand the CDD, you have to step back a layer and understand the structural disparities that were built into the district prior to the CDD. 10 of 12 magnet schools were located in South Minneapolis. So that meant because of the zoned nature of those magnet schools, North Minneapolis students just had access to fewer magnets, a structurally racist problem. 3 of 5 international baccalaureate programs at the high school level were located in South Minneapolis, replicating the same access issues to magnet schools at the high school level. And so you also had tremendous enrollment imbalances. Southwest Minneapolis schools, which are majority white, busting at the seams with more students than they could accommodate, and North Minneapolis schools, half empty, with a higher concentration of high need students like those eligible for free and reduced lunch, special ed, and English learner services. And so what the CDD sought to do is relocate magnet schools. So several were relocated to North Minneapolis, which had the fewest number, make access to those citywide, and use those magnet schools as a vehicle for integration. That was one goal. And then they also had to change boundaries, or they thought they needed to change boundaries in order to better balance enrollment, because you had this problem of all these Southwest Minneapolis schools with too many students and schools in other parts of the city with too few. And because funding goes with the student, what that meant is that our lowest enrolled schools, which tend to be the blackest schools in our district, were also the lowest funded. So the CDD set out to remedy some of those built-in structural issues. And, we can argue about whether they did that effectively or not. But I think the jury this is the first year we're seeing it implemented. So I just think it's too soon to decide if it was successful or not.
I want to say one other thing on the placement piece. The other thing that it did is that it added a second lottery, right? And it, before, Minneapolis families could try to enroll into any school in the city, not just magnet schools in their zone, right? If they could provide their own transportation. So who has their own transportation, right? People who have resources, right? And automobiles. And we know that correlates with whiteness and wealth, right? So what the district found from those previous policies is that because of the enrollment timeline, which you have to submit your choices in February for the lottery, right? The people who were able in February to submit forms knowing where they would live in September, right, are people who tend to have very stable housing, right? So it was mostly white, wealthy families. And they were also utilizing this open enrollment as well as the magnet process, right, to put their kids into whiter, less integrated schools, right, than their neighborhood school. So that is another piece of this. And again, like I said earlier, right, there's a lot of racism threads throughout this. And even if you're well-meaning, right, you're well-intentioned, you're only thinking what's best for my kid, right, and you're not on purpose being racist, right, the summation of those individual behaviors, right, often lead to segregation. They lead to these imbalances, these inequities, these disparities in our school system.
Here's a question, a stumper. Do you think white middle class parents are too precious about where they send their kids to school? Because I have a theory, and it's not very well informed, but I think if you come from a stable family who provides you with resources, it kind of like doesn't matter. Like there's the Jefferson School, which I think the name is being changed to Ella Baker. Yep. I've been in that school to vote. I don't spend a lot of time there. I don't have a kid, but like the kids seem...
People would think it was weird if you were just hanging out there, John.
The kids seem great. And if I had a kid, why would I not want my kid to have all these other kids as their classmates? None of them are white. The Wedge is largely a white neighborhood.
You should ask all of your white neighbors with kids why they were mostly sending them to Barton before this. Yeah.
The Wedge has fewer kids than a lot of other places, but there are kids here. And apparently none of the white parents send their kids to our neighborhood school. It's right here in the neighborhood. You could walk a few blocks. From any place in the neighborhood, you walk a few blocks to the school. No white students there at all.
Well, and I can tell you from lived experience, part of the CDD was relocating, several magnet schools to the north side in a hope to integrate schools by bringing, white kids to black schools instead of busing, kids of color into white neighborhood schools. My kids attend a north side magnet, and what I can tell you, having looked at their class pictures, and I'm a volunteer at the school, and they're the only white kids in their class, in their grades. And so, yes, white parents unfortunately haven't opted in to the vision the CDD, attempted to create. And I think that's in large part because they're very precious about where they send their kids. My kids are having a great time at their North Side Magnet School, which is 98% kids of color. More than 90% of kids are eligible for free and reduced lunch. My kids are doing great. And I have nothing but great things to say about the school. But unfortunately, white parents haven't, in large numbers, opted into those systems or those schools.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm one of those white parents who hasn't done it, and I will fully own that. Like, my child goes to one of the most segregated schools in the city. It just happens to be segregated in a different way, right? It's predominantly white. And,
and Melissa's on her journey, and
I'm on my journey, and I'm
had many had candid conversations.
And I know Sara has more to say to me about
preciousness.
I mean, you could move to the Wedge.
I think that's the thing, right? Is that it's moving, and so for my family, when my son was born, we lived in the Lyndale neighborhood, not far from Lyndale School, which at the time was, almost an exact reflection of the city schools, in a demographic way. And about the time my son was 1, we started talking about moving for some, it was our starter house, right? We wanted a larger place and some other issues. And when I started talking to people, they're like, you can't send him to that school. I was like, why can't I send him there? Well, I had someone who told me he would be the only person in his class who spoke English at home. Right. And, and I will fully admit, right, to like listening to the alarm in people around me about that. Right. And that, and I have to own that, right, that I listened to that. Right. And I think that it had, part of our choice of location was geographic in terms of like where my husband's job is, but part of it was listening to those voices, right? And I will say it was other white women, right, who are saying these are the acceptable places, and I didn't interrogate that.
White women.
That's a different episode.
Yeah.
Will you come back for the white women episode?
I mean, I don't know.
Before we get to our solutions section, is there anything else we should add about the dire circumstances of our students and teachers and families in Minneapolis?
I'm lucky to be a part of two North Side school communities, and have been for many years, and I've watched that community bury beloved children, especially over the last 2 years. And the murder of D. Hill, 2 weeks ago has rocked North High School and Lucy Laney Elementary and Franklin Middle School in ways I cannot describe or overstate. And that state of emergency that Minneapolis schools and students are facing just requires more fucks given by everyone, whether you have a kid in those public schools or not. What is happening for Minneapolis kids right now should concern everyone. And there are ways to show up for these kids and for the schools they attend. And it's just critically important that people do that. I hope your listeners will consider some of the ways Melissa and I can recommend that they show up, but it's just critically important to show up. Find a way, whether it's calling a legislator or defunding your PTA, which is another episode, but
Sarah
I want to get
do
that
an
plug
episode
in.
on that.
Let's do the defund the PTA. I can't wait. Why can't we talk about that?
Parent fundraising in Minneapolis Public Schools perpetuates tremendous racial disparities, and you should defund your PTA as a way to dismantle that white supremacist system. But there are lots of ways to show up for Minneapolis kids and Minneapolis schools right now. And I just implore you and your loyal listeners to do that.
And I would just say too, we're going to talk about those ways to help, but the school district does have a vaccine requirement for staff and volunteers, or you can opt out with testing. That's currently in place. Many school buildings are allowing volunteers to come in and work with kids. So, if you have a few hours a week, like kids need, kids need relationships with adults who are not their parents, right? That can be really transformative and important in the lives of children. So just because you don't have a child, right, doesn't mean that you can't be involved in the lives of children.
What kind of things do volunteers do with the kids? Reading to them, or?
Yeah, can I make, so the most important need and the plug I want to make, actually more than half of Minneapolis public school students don't read at grade level. a problem that has grown worse in the last 3 years of COVID disruptions. One of the most meaningful ways you can show up for Minneapolis Public Schools is to sign up to be a Reading Corps volunteer. Reading Corps is a nonprofit that operates in many Minneapolis public school buildings, providing one-on-one learning support for reading. And that is a critical need and a way, you sign up through the website, you do the background check and, prove your vaccine status. And they give you the training and materials, and you can show up in a really meaningful and important way. And I think that's the one I want to jump in and plug.
Okay. So now when we are on to our solutions section, and I'm
We're
just
on to
gonna
solutions.
copy straight from Melissa's article. Number 1, reach out to your state representatives, your senators, Governor Walz, and ask for them to use a portion of that $8 billion surplus to fill the nearly $1 billion gap in unfunded mandates for special ed and English learner services, right?
Yeah, I would say that is the number. If, you should feel disappointed if Governor Walz and Speaker Hortman and majority or minority leader Franzen, when the budget comes out the 28th, right? And they release their proposals like in the coming days after that. If that is not on their list, right? First of all, you should tell them now, and then if it's not on their list, you should tell them many times more that they are wrong, and that needs to be on that list.
Raise hell if it's not included in their proposals for the surplus.
Number 2, consider the impact, and we're talking about white parents here, of disenrolling and or maintaining the homogeneity of white middle-class students' education. I think we covered that with the white parents, the middle-class parents.
I think Sara says, right, your school choice is your funding choice.
You're making a literal investment in where you decide to send your kids to school, an incredibly important investment. And so your school choice decision isn't just where your child should attend, it's where money is going to go. And I encourage all parents, talking to you, Melissa, to consider what those choices are. MPS is in the midst of the second lottery right now. So Minneapolis Public School parents have until April, I think, 4th to submit their school choice for next school year. And I have encouraged, especially parents in white bodies, do not disenroll from this district right now. We need you too much. Edina and private schools and all those things, I think, are a siren call. Many parents haven't been able to resist the last 3 years, but it's such an all hands on deck moment, and we just need to stop the bleeding through disenrollment, and especially those in white bodies with privilege. Like, we need you to stay in Minneapolis Public Schools.
Yeah, and I would say, I think that, if the magnet option is not appealing to you, right, you can still stay in MPS as a white parent. The district's own data will show you that your child will get a very good education. I believe, right, that the test score data for white students in MPS is higher than the state average, right? So you are getting an above average education for your white students, right? We can talk about, the challenges the district has educating students who are not white, right? That's like a whole other conversation. But yeah, if you're a white parent in Ward 13, in Ward 10, in Ward 7, right, you can send your kids to a very good public school and be part of a system, right, that we need.
And number 3, donate directly to North and Central Minneapolis schools through Achieve Minneapolis. who can tell me what Achieve Minneapolis is?
So that's a recommendation that comes from me, and it's in part response to the prolific role that PTAs and private foundations play in Minneapolis Public Schools right now. A dozen of our district's whitest schools are raising and spending a combined millions of dollars a year in those dozen buildings. The rest of the district doesn't have access to that private fundraising to supplement and subsidize their budgets. So I've encouraged folks to defund their PTA and instead donate to Achieve Minneapolis, which is a nonprofit run in conjunction with the district that acts as a nonprofit basically for Minneapolis Public Schools. You can donate to Achieve and earmark it for a specific school. And I've recommended that you choose a North Side or Central Corridor school because that's where the most historical disinvestment has occurred in the district.
Okay. I think it's really important that people read. If they couldn't listen to the whole thing and they don't get to the part where I recommend that they read Melissa's article, I should have said this at the beginning. You can read the whole thing. It's like 4,500 words. It's extremely long, but it's very compelling. And as I said, there's a bombshell in every paragraph, and it should spur you to take action.
Can I make a quick shameless
Absolutely,
plug
yes.
as well for folks to check? I gave an ed talk in November. It's titled How Parent Fundraising Perpetuates Racial Disparities in Minneapolis Public Schools. You can find it on YouTube, but it covers 20 years of school funding history in about 12 minutes and talks about some better practices for especially parents in white bodies to consider. So I hope people will check that out as well.
12 minutes? We've been here for 66 minutes. I don't feel very efficient.
Well, all you need to do is watch the ed talk, John, and you'll have it all.
Watch it on 2X. I mean, you can do it in 6 minutes.
There you go.
You're just emphasizing to me how bad I am at this, that I drag out these conversations.
Well, we appreciate you hosting it, really.
Yeah, thanks for thanks for letting us talk on our soapbox and hopefully get people, a little bit jazzed up. Like I said, you cannot overstate the central role that schools play in the lives of children and families, right? These are our public schools. It is a public service that we provide to everyone, right? It's like no one is turned away, right, from public schools. And so it's very important.
Melissa Whitler, who writes for Southwest Voices, read her article. And Sara Spafford Freeman, thank you both for joining me. This has been the Wedge Live podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards. Thank you for listening.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.